All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a live edition of The Compliance Guy. My name is Sean Weiss, and as always, I like to begin by expressing my appreciation for each and every single one of you who's taking time out of your very busy schedule to join in and listen in to what it is that I and my very special guests are talking about today. Because we have so much going on and so much that we really want to get to with the DOJ takedown and the delay in the price transparency and some of the other stuff going on with telehealth tied to behavioral health and mental care for patients. I'm going to avoid doing any kind of a long introduction and monologue. I'm joined today by two of my awesome friends, Matt Lawhon, attorney extraordinaire out of Frisco, Texas, and Eric Rubenstein, who's just Eric Rubenstein. But again, thank you to everybody for tuning in and spending your morning with us. We are live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I have turned on the chat feature, and we are happy to take any of your questions, comments, or concerns throughout the course of the show. So with that said, I want to jump. Oh, before I do, I want to send out my well wishes to our little chucklehead buddy, Jordan Johnson, who's still in the hospital, but he is doing well. He is on the road to recovery. Jordan can share with you whatever it is that he wants to share with you, so I don't violate the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And it's okay for me to say he's in the hospital because Jordan posted a picture of him in his bed for the next 5 days. So I think I'm clear on that. I don't think I'll have Courtney Petty from OCR reaching out to me anytime soon, telling me I violated HIPAA. Eric, I could see the look on your face. I was waiting for one of your comments.
Well, this isn't the chuckleheads. So okay. I got to keep it compliance guy compliant. Right. So killing me. It's killing me.
So I'm going to take my hat off for this one for a little while, because our topics are going to make me sweat. And I want to jump right in. Let's talk about this DOJ takedown. Eric, let me pause and turn it over to you, and we'll kind of explore that from a law enforcement standpoint, and then obviously, Matt, I want to get your perspective as an attorney on where you think some of this stuff is going to go.
Yeah, so if you're watching the press releases that come out from DOJ, there was over the past, I think it was 5 or 6 weeks, they actually did it as a coordinated effort over those 5 or 6 weeks. 138 defendants, over $1 billion in losses, primarily from what they are continuing to call the telehealth or the telemedicine stuff. So the first thing to understand is that traditionally when these roundups started by the OIG, they were typically done over a 2 or 3 day period. They weren't done over multiple weeks. When those roundups first started, boy, they were a real challenge. I remember we would get them, we would get our leads for the cases. And if we didn't have any in New Jersey, you'd get assigned to something in one of the strike force cities, which is where they typically started. So if you didn't actually have one of your own case, and if you weren't assigned to one, and for me, it'd be in New York, then they would ship you off to lands near and far, because the coordinated effort was really over a 2 or 3 day period where you're talking about 100 or more people being arrested, multiple search warrants being done, and things of that sort. Very, very complicated. And I think what the general public tends to not see in the background is all of that coordination that goes on. We're not talking about arresting 1 or 2 people or doing a search warrant at a couple of places. You're talking about the coordinated efforts of arresting 100 or more people over multiple jurisdictions and venues. So you're talking about securing search warrants and arrest warrants in different districts. you may be an agent working in New York, having a case where one of your defendants is in Florida. So now you've got to coordinate with the office down there. And, I see Matt shaking his head because he knows from having worked in Mafuku and probably from, even his days now just trolling the halls of the courthouse where you see these sort of residual things. So this latest coordinated effort was not done over a 3-day period. It was done over multiple weeks. And, typically what winds up happening is they'll have a case that they want to make a bigger splash about. And so they'll have something where the complaint will be ready to go, it's sealed, or the person has been arrested, but it's quietly done because they are seeking cooperation from the individual. And so there's no press release or announcement or anything along those lines. But this was a big one, right? 138 defendants. A good chunk of them were healthcare providers. But what has been the norm over the past, I think, couple of operations is that it's non-healthcare providers. So when we're talking about the telemedicine or telehealth cases, and Sean, you and I talk about this all the time, is the fact that these are not telehealth or telemedicine cases. These are telemarketing cases where they're using a telephone to help perpetuate the fraud against the seniors, whether it be through things like social engineering or things of that sort. So it's really not telemedicine. It's really telemarketing fraud. And then if you look at this press release, the big things, right, are the continued DME issues still going on. The DME issues, the genetic testing issues, and laboratory services are going to continue to be part of it. The pharmacy stuff is still going to be part of it. You're seeing press releases coming out on compounding fraud still from the 2015, 2016 era. I think we're going to still continue to see some of those residual and spin-off cases. But now we're starting to see some of the COVID-19 related frauds. The big ones are going to be those COVID-19 add-ons, things like the patient is getting a COVID-19 test, but then they're also throwing on some other ancillary tests that may not even be relevant to what the patient's condition is, some respiratory pathogen testing, the genetic testing, things of that sort. So these are going to continue on. 138 defendants. There's probably a pretty good chance that if you threw a bunch of spaghetti on the wall, a lot of it's going to stick with respect to spin-off cases. So,
absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And real quick, and I didn't mean to step on what you were saying. Yeah. So, this is huge because there are 42 doctors that are being indicted. 42 doctors, nurses, and other licensed medical professionals in 31 federal districts across the United States. I mean, this is a massive coordinated effort.
Right.
And, I'm just going to say it. Shame on these people. Shame on these people for not only taking advantage of, a pandemic situation, but in general, for being so dishonest and disloyal to their profession.
So it's a third, right? So basically a third of the people that were charged out of the 138 defendants are healthcare professionals. And the rest are going to be people like these marketing people, these sales reps, laboratory owners, or things along those lines. Obviously the amount of money that was put out during COVID-19 was enormous. And there was such a relaxing of the rules that it was really just ripe to occur. Yeah. Interestingly enough, there was an article that was just put out today that there's a real push to make a lot of the telemedicine rules permanent, and there's a push to increase the ability of things like telemental health. I mean, people who really took COVID-19 about as serious as it should be, in my opinion at least. Those are people that really restricted their individual groups. They're people who really socially isolated themselves. I know one of the big areas, I do some consulting in the social adult daycare area. And one of the biggest issues in the social adult daycare area, which is a Medicaid covered service, was, these people already isolated, and these people that are having some early stages of dementia. It'll be really interesting to see, going forward, what sort of psychological effects the COVID-19 isolation did for people. But, there's this push to make some of these rules permanent. And obviously the telemedicine world is excited to have that happen, because traditionally CMS had been a little slow in its definition of telehealth, and that the rule regarding the metropolitan statistical areas and originating sites and the like. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward. But I do think that as everything else on these large operations go, it really is the tip of the iceberg, because you're going to see there's going to be providers and there's going to be professionals that come in who are going to want to cooperate, because if they're facing substantial jail time for 20 or $30 million, which some of these cases were, someone's going to want to try to cooperate and help themselves and not have a 20-year prison sentence or a 15-year prison sentence.
That's right. That's right. So, real quick, it's interesting how this case actually breaks down. So to Eric's point, it was $1.4 billion in alleged losses. Of the $1.4 billion, they are indicating that $1.1 billion of this amount is tied to telecommunications. They're still calling it telehealth, but they're putting in parens telecommunications. Just call it what it is. It's telefraud. It's what this is. 29 million in COVID-19 healthcare fraud, 133 million connected to substance abuse treatment facilities, or what are referred to as sober homes, and 160 million connected to other healthcare fraud and illegal opioid distribution schemes. I mean, so these geniuses really ran the gamut on this thing. I mean, from creating schemes to get kickbacks, illegal remunerations, all the way through illegal prescribing of opioids.
Well, I think if you really take a look at the press release on this, all-encompassing action, if you compare and contrast that to the everyday publications on OIG's enforcement action website or the Justice Department's enforcement action website, these are the cases that you're seeing every day highlighted. I think we've had conversations before about the number of cases that get published about drug diversion of controlled substances by a physician. Eric's very good about constantly updating us and his feed through LinkedIn on the telemarketing schemes. Right. Just for you, Eric, telemarketing. I'm not going to call it telehealth, right? So, and then the sober homes are one of those issues that kind of started in Florida, migrated to California. I think that's one of the under the radar ones from the standpoint of, these sober homes, they're not covered by Medicare. They're not covered by Medicaid. They're almost a strictly commercial product. And from my standpoint, it's going to be interesting to see, is DOJ's law enforcement going to apply the Travel Act with these cases? Are they going to latch on to some criminal state statute and bring it forward? Or are they going to try to, because they're alleging in these sober home cases kickbacks? Well, there's not a private insurance federal kickback statute. Right?
No, but where that may come into play, Matt, is the ECRA statute, right? Limiting kickbacks.
Right. That's true. That's true.
So hold on for just a second before you go any further. Let's talk about ECRA, okay? And let's talk about what this is, because this is a little known statute or regulation that I don't think enough people are talking about, and enough people don't understand what ECRA is. Can you talk a little bit about what that is for a moment, Eric or Matt?
So I'm going to defer to Matt, because that's really going to be sort of a legal analysis of the statute.
Yeah. So what ECRA is ECRA is a response to this sober home fraud. Congress somewhat hastily created this act. And if you take time, Sean, I'm sure you have, because you're such a voracious reader, have read the ECRA statute. It's really kind of poorly written. But what it does is essentially kind of expands the anti-kickback statute to sober homes, labs, and there's another entity that's taken into account, but it's applied to, it's applicable to all health plans, right? Not just federal. And so what they do is essentially copy or build upon the anti-kickback statute that's specific to federal payers and kind of make it applicable to private insurers. Now, the interesting thing is, they've made it, it's the Ending Kickbacks and Recovery Act, right? But the applicability to the clinical lab space is not limited to drug testing. Right. So ECRA, that's the kind of the confusing thing about ECRA is, well, if it's the Ending Kickbacks and Recovery Act, why are these relationships with clinical labs being scrutinized that aren't applicable to the sober home industry?
Yep. So if you'll humor me just for a minute, let me give a non-legal description of ECRA, right? So, what we're talking about falls under 18 USC subsection 220. This is where you'll find it. And it's called the Eliminating Kickbacks in Recovery Act. Okay. And really what it's trying to do is to allow the government to take aggressive steps to really counter the national opioid crisis in the United States. But there's a lot of things, right? So here's what they're trying to do. Okay. One, they're trying to end the ability to solicit or receive any kind of remuneration. So we're talking about kickbacks, bribes, rebates. And rebates has become a huge topic. And we could talk about rebates for hours. I know Eric and I, we just took on a new civil investigative demand today for a group. And we could talk about rebates and how these distributors are pushing these things. So again, they're trying to eliminate the solicitation or receipt of any remunerations, including kickbacks, bribes, or rebates, whether it's directly or indirectly, overtly, or covertly in cash or in kind in return for basically a provider's referral, or a patient referral to a recovery home. So that's what Matt's talking about with the sober homes, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. It's also to a clinical treatment facility or a laboratory.
Yeah.
Right. So those
that's
are the
what
ones.
it was, the clinical treatment facility.
Right. So it's recovery homes, clinical treatment facilities, or laboratories. They're trying to avoid people paying or offering any sort of remuneration, to induce a referral of an individual to a recovery home, clinical treatment facility, or laboratory in exchange for an individual using the services of that recovery home, clinical treatment facility, or laboratory. So there's really 5 things that people need to be aware of when it comes to ECRA. Okay. And the first one is what we talked about, right? It's the Eliminating Kickbacks and Recovery Act, right? EKRA, that's what it is. 2, people in 2021 have already actually pled guilty to ECRA violations based on DOJ investigations.
Right.
I mean, they already have people who have pled guilty. The third thing to keep in mind is that, and I agree with Matt 100%, it is a broadly written statute. It is not well written at all. And the problem that you run into with ECRA is that it is more broadly written than the anti-kickback statute and other federal statutes, right? Okay.
Yeah, and it has some inconsistent internal language within it that makes the statute difficult to interpret and to apply. And so I actually find the sober home aspect of this big takedown one of the more interesting components, right? Because as an attorney who has to advise clients on regulatory matters, ECRA has always been that stepchild that we don't really know what to do with.
Right.
And so with this kind of broad action on law enforcement's part, we within the legal community and y'all as well that consult entities might get some better direction on how DOJ is going to go about enforcing ECRA.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And the last two parts very quickly. So I've talked about three of them. The last two, ECRA significantly alters the nature of the relationship between a laboratory and their marketing and sales personnel. And that's a huge thing that laboratories are having to deal with is the limitations put on their ability to market themselves and for their sales folks to be able to go out. And then
Sean, it's going to be what I think is going to be interesting. It's going to be when some of these pleas come out, because we don't know what anyone was really charged with, right? The press release is very broad, which is fine. It's 138 people. A lot of it was in Southern California. So that was the main press release was California. But what's interesting is going to be, when people finally plead guilty to any of the sober home related stuff, what those charges were. I mean, I think the issue on the sober homes where a government payer is going to come into play is potentially as the spinoff actually off of the sober homes are going to be the intensive outpatient programs, the IOPs, and urine drug testing and presumptive and definitive. And, it's pretty clear when you read industry guidance, when you read analyses that are done by places like the NIH and stuff regarding the cadence of the randomness that you start off doing targeted, every 3 or 4 days you do a presumptive. And if that presumptive comes out with a yes, because the presumptive is a yes, no. If it comes up with a yes, you then do your definitive. But, the issue is if you're keeping someone who's in an IOP for 60 days and every 3 days you're doing a definitive, then that's really inconsistent with everything that's out there. And there's big money in that. And so I think some of what we're going to see with respect to the opioid issues, the sober homes, is going to be the urine drug testing and the presumptive versus the definitive, or sometimes the definitive is qualitative.
Right. Qualitative and quantitative. Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And the last point that I'll make about ECRA, and then we can move on from that. But I just thought, when I was so grateful, I don't know whether it was Matt or Eric who brought it up, but it's such a little known statute and people just aren't aware of what it is. And the last thing that I'll say about it is that, violation of ECRA law also violates other federal statutes. So, you're probably not going to see somebody just simply charged for violation of ECRA. You're going to see them also brought up on other federal charges as well, is the point that I'm trying to make.
Well, I mean, that happens, pretty regularly, right? If you're violating the federal healthcare fraud statute, likely DOJ is going to present on a wire fraud statute, right? Or money laundering.
The conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud.
Right. Conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering. These are, because in a fraud case, you're dealing with money, you're doing something with the money, and that's going to be the impetus for the healthcare fraud is the specified unlawful act, the SUA for the money laundering stuff. So I mean, you're right. ECRA is probably moving in that same direction as well.
Yeah, we would charge with the healthcare fraud statute. Often you would see the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey would charge 18 U.S.C. 1349, which is conspiracy under that statute. So it'd be conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. And then 1347, healthcare fraud. And then even on the kickback cases, you would see the charge would be the 42 U.S.C. 1320 A or B, but then you'd also see 18 U.S.C. 371, which is that sort of broad umbrella conspiracy charge out there. Right. And then this way, a defendant has an opportunity to plead to a conspiracy, which only has a 5-year statutory maximum, versus the healthcare fraud statute, which has, I think it's 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah. So, you sort of, U.S. Attorney's Office sort of bakes that in so that when Matt comes in to make his pitch, his guy can plead or his gal can plead to the lesser included offense of the conspiracy, and then you're statutorily only going to be capped at 60 months, even if the losses are in excess of 60 months. If you can have someone who has a case where the losses could under the U.S. sentencing, the advisory guidelines, they could have a sentencing range that gives them 9 or 10 years or 12 years because of all of the additional things that come about from the calculations. But if you're on a conspiracy and you're capped to 60 months, then you're not really worried about all of those other add-ons, because 60 months is the most you'll get. And Matt would probably argue to his client, look, you can get a break by pleading to this conspiracy charge versus losing a trial. You're looking at 8, 12, 15 years. Conspiracy is 60 months. You'll get your 54 days of good time a year, and you'll be out in 4 years instead of 5.
Yeah, or they'll get a work release or something, early release for good behavior or something like that. Whatever.
Well, COVID, they were doing
compassionate
releases because of COVID. Yeah. People who had shorter sentences and things of that sort.
I wonder, Matt, from a legal perspective, because Eric and I, we talked about this before, and we've actually seen it, right? Individuals being charged with obstruction in a lot of these healthcare fraud cases now. Mm-hmm. I wonder if any of these, based on what you've seen from the DOJ press release, whether you think any of them, I know it's a general release, but whether or not you think the government may try to trump up some other charges like obstruction as well, just to try to get people to turn on each other or, plea out quick.
Well, I think it's always a possibility. And I think, I come at it from the same perspective that Eric's come at it, right? I mean, who hasn't from the investigative side said, you know what, if you're lying to me, there's this thing called 1001 charge. We can lock you up for that, right? And convince them to do that. But the obstruction, yeah, it would not surprise me if at some point in time, I think Eric mentioned it earlier, or you might have in the conversation, just speculation that this is the tip of the sword, right? There's going to be some more spinoff cases, and the spinoff cases might be developed through, hey, we've got you on this obstruction charge because you were falsifying records or you were destroying records, right? We've got proof of that. Now you're just a little fish. We're not really concerned about you, but tell us what you know. So, I think your instinct is correct. That might be a viable tool for investigators to use against the low level people, because it's always the lower level people that were probably the ones having to manufacture a record or destroy a record, that expose themselves more often to that obstruction charge or that 1001 charge.
The interesting thing about 1001 is that in my career, it was the charge that everybody lies, but yet no one ever gets charged. And then Martha Stewart gets charged. Remember? Martha Stewart actually got what she did turned out to not be a crime. But the FBI was out. It was an SEC-related case, a stock transaction. She lied to the FBI, so they charged her with 1001. And I remember after Martha Stewart, I remember going out and doing interviews with people, and I would say, there's this charge of lying to a federal agent. You remember Martha Stewart? And she became like the poster child. I will tell you, though, that when I was an agent, we did charge – U.S. Attorney's Office did charge a defendant one time, and that was because he was in a proffer. He was an accountant. He was an accountant, and he had instructed all of these cardiologists. This was part of the spinoff from the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey case, in which it's a whole other story to have, but essentially they brought in about 15 or 16 cardiologists from the community to bolster referrals for catheterizations. And what happened was a lot of these doctors were foreign doctors who were foreign medical graduates.
Wait, did you say dental?
No, medical.
Oh. Yeah, no, it was the school is UMDMJ. It's in Newark, New Jersey. It's the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New
Jersey.
I would not want to get a catheter from a dentist.
No, I wouldn't either. It's a tough place to start. So what happened was this guy is, he has all of these doctors that he does their tax returns and business accounting for. And a lot of them, their wives didn't have the requisite 40 quarters to collect Social Security.
Right.
So what he was doing was he was saying to the doc, look, you make $1 million. offset your salary by 100,000 and pay your wife and pay your kids or whatever it was. So there was no tax issue. But by doing that, they were then qualifying their family for Social Security benefits that they wouldn't have gotten. And so we're interviewing this accountant about that, and he lies. And the AUSA was not happy about that and charged them with 1,001. But to Matt's point on the obstruction, and to your point on the obstruction, I think the bigger one is it's not just obstruction; it's obstruction of a governmental audit, which is 18,
Right.
18, 15, 16, I think it is. And what people I think forget is that when your local UPIC or MAC or RAC are requesting records, or the fiscal intermediary for the state, or your OMIG, any of these organizations that are administering a government program on behalf of CMS or Medicaid are in this quasi-governmental world. And so when they request records from you and you fabricate those records, you're obstructing a governmental audit and you're creating a problem for yourself. So I think people tend to forget that when the UPIC is requesting stuff from a provider, that they're working on behalf, they're an extension of the government.
Right.
And I think that people tend to forget that, that's a factor.
Who do you think was more brokenhearted over Martha getting charged, her or Snoop Dogg?
Well, I don't think her and Snoop were tight yet.
Oh, yeah.
I think they became tight after that.
Okay, well,
they might have. Yeah, they might. But it's one of those things where you find some example in life, and it's like you go, hey, listen, I've never seen this, but I've heard of one-eyed cats with 4 teeth. You don't want to be the one-eyed cat with 4 teeth, right? Like, don't be that person. Like, I've never seen 1,001, and then Martha Stewart gets charged. And you're like, look,
and it's all over the place.
Seen this, but it's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so staying on this topic, right? Because we started talking about telemedicine, right? Let's take the conversation a little bit further, and let's talk about the removal of the GeoZips that is being pushed to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So for all of you who are listening on the podcast, or those of you who are listening in or watching in live today, there is a push being made by groups. And really, I think the biggest one right now is being made by the behavioral health and psychiatric providers to remove the geographical restrictions that are currently placed onto the teleservices. So essentially what they're asking for, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, is for basically that 1135 waiver that said you could practice across state lines without having to have a license in that state. They're asking for that now to be a permanent fixture tied to telehealth services for behavioral health and psychiatric services. So Eric, Matt, want to comment on that, please?
I'll defer to Eric.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like that's one of the issues is the issue with the 1135 waivers was to allow people across state lines to do that. And I think the long-term issue is going to be what the states feel about that. Like, does the California licensing board really want someone practicing in their state who hasn't met the requirements of people in the state? Are you putting someone at a disadvantage? It's almost like, I can't pass the California bar. Does that mean I get to practice law in California via telephone? If I'm doing some sort of telemental health or telemedicine and I'm in a state, maybe the licensure requirements are really different. Like in some states, you take podiatry. In some states, licensure allows podiatrists to practice from below the knee. In other states, it's only below the ankle. Or ankle and below, I should say.
Ankle and below, right, yeah.
Ankle and below. And so, at what point do you draw that line? And I think this is going to be a long-term evolving process. The issue from a law enforcement perspective and a data analytics perspective is going to be the monkey wrench that this is now thrown in. because now you're going to have instances where you've got a provider in one state that's listed as the ordering or referring for a patient in another state, with a pharmacy or a DME supplier or a lab in a third state. I mean, that's sort of that fraud triangle. I talk about that all the time, is when you've got the lack of patient prescriber or patient and referring, patient and dispensing organization. And now in the world of geospacing and geofencing, you can take a look at that and come up with some metrics to say, like, why is Dr. Shawn Weiss in California writing a prescription for Eric Rubenstein in New Jersey, and why is it being filled by a pharmacy owned by Matt Lawhon in Florida? You go, hey, that's problematic. And, is Shawn Weiss licensed in New Jersey? Because if he's writing a prescription for me in New Jersey, well, that's practicing in that state. So does he have a non-resident license or whatever it is? I think that a lot of this is going to become an evolution that is going to just have to, work itself out. And remember, CMS, when COVID hit, they were really just working to try to ensure continuity of care for the beneficiary population. When I was an OIG agent, people would always say the biggest fight you're ever going to have is with CMS, because they want to give out the money and the OIG wants to keep the money. And so, but those are public health issues,
right?
And CMS is working to try to maintain a public health, continuity of care.
And just to
go ahead, Matt.
I'm sorry. Just to add to your point, Eric, I think it is going to be an evolving process, and I think it by nature it has to be that way. I think there's going to be some confusion and some clarity need to be given. What if I, Matt Lawhon, am a licensed physician in Texas seeing a patient virtually in Oklahoma? Am I practicing in Oklahoma or am I practicing in Texas? I think there needs to be some clarity about where you're actually considered practicing medicine virtually, right? Some more precise language provided. The other thing that I think is going to be interesting, and maybe it's just the cynical nature that I have, but what if you have a physician's clinic, right? They're operating in a brick and mortar clinic, but are allowed to, under this benefit, provide virtual services. What if these virtual services are being provided by a PA or an NP, and they're trying to bill everything as incident to, right? Let's throw that ugly word out there. Incident to the physician who is there in the clinic. Does that meet does that meet the incident to standard? I've read some things that CMS has published that said, they have to be an integral part. Does that mean the physician has to poke his head in on the Zoom call and say, how's everything going? Or, I think
to your point, right. But and I agree with you. There has to be clarity on this stuff, because under the 1135 waivers, they actually they waived those requirements on the incident to, and they actually waived a lot of the requirements into teaching hospital settings as well. So yeah, I agree with you. All right. So I think we're good on the DOJ takedown. I think we're good on the telemedicine expansion, for behavioral health and psychiatric services. Before we get into price transparency, this has just kind of been bothering me since early this morning, Eric. And I can't stress this enough, folks. If you have somebody from the Office of Inspector General show up, or somebody from a government agency show up and serve you a subpoena, or serve you with a CID, a civil investigative demand, don't go into a room and sit down with them and start verbal vomiting and having conversations about the things that are going on because you think you're doing it right. Decline to engage in a dialogue until you have legal representation. Because if you give up something without realizing you're giving it up because you don't realize you're doing something potentially problematic, you have just put yourself into a box that becomes very hard to climb out of. I don't know why I felt compelled to say that, but I mean, it's happening more often than I can I can stand. And
well, and can I interject something?
Please,
Sean?
please.
You know, and Eric, I think you can back me up on this. To the provider community out there, civil investigative demand, a subpoena, they're not going to. You're not required to turn over anything immediately. You know, there's always a time frame associated with that. So it's not like they can show up, present you with the CID, present you with the subpoena, and they tell you they get to walk out with the documents. That's not how it works. There's no.
Well, there's, you know, the only examples I know where that potentially happens is, and I've had this only happen. I had this happen one time in my career where we got what they call a forthwith subpoena issued, and a forthwith subpoena is actually you will give me the things right now, and that's because you believe, and you actually have to go to a judge to get that order, because it's essentially a court order. It's a step above a subpoena, but it's treated like a subpoena because you are going in and saying, look, to the judge, we believe that there is a risk of imminent destruction of this item, this document. We don't have probable cause for a search warrant. Like I had this, for example, we were doing an investigation on a physical therapist, and at the time it was, I think, the PSC or the ZPIC. They went out and did an interview of the provider as part of their investigation, and the provider had a whole bunch of appointment books. And he said, and they asked about them, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm in the middle of cleaning out my closet. I'm getting them destroyed tomorrow. I have a company coming, like a shredding company, and they're going to destroy these old books tomorrow." And the investigators called us up, and we got a forthwith subpoena to be able to make sure that we got those, like, you know, drove out and got them that day, to make sure that we got them. The only other time that there's typically an instance where there's, I would say, a heightened production timeline is under the OIG's inspection authority. We would be able to go in and demand access to records. And there's this clause about 24 hours to produce the records, or you risk being suspended, or, you know, a temporary suspension or something along those lines. But generally speaking, you have a time period under which, you know, you can turn them over. But, you know, look, I do a lot of presentations. I talk to a lot of provider groups, a lot of compliance groups, and I have a slide that I use as sort of my staple, which is, do you have the following things in your compliance policy? And there's a whole section I talk about with respect to interactions with law enforcement. And it's everything from law enforcement does a knock and talk at your office during business hours. Law enforcement does a knock and talk to your employees after business hours. Law enforcement shows up with a subpoena. Law enforcement shows up with a search warrant. I mean, the worst thing that I've seen happen was during a search warrant, you're dealing typically with the lowest level employee. It's the front desk person. They're minimum wage or a little bit more. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times I did search warrants where the owner of the business shows up and doesn't get out of their car.
They turn around and drive away.
And then turns around and drives away. And you know, it's a 22 or 23-year-old person who's sitting at the front desk, and they're having to deal with, you know, federal agents and get boxes and search warrants and pictures and all of that stuff. And so, yeah, like, you know, you've got to be in a position where you've got to be able to educate your staff on, if law enforcement shows up, what do you do? There are things that you should and shouldn't do.
That's right.
And there are ways that you should and shouldn't act, and things of that sort.
I think we're going to do a segment in the very near future on what needs to be in your corporate compliance program with respect to subpoenas, law enforcement, interviews, things of that nature, and really spend some time doing a deep dive on that. But my good buddy, Medicare Compliance One, I love it. You're right. Docs always seem to think they can talk their way out of trouble. And what they wind up doing is getting themselves into more trouble. So, all right. Now let's go ahead and shift gears. And I want to start this part of the conversation by saying, I think this will be a prime example of how individuals can have a bit of a differing opinion on something, but still have a civil conversation, a respectful discussion about it, and walk away saying, I understand the other person's position. I still feel the same way about my position on it. But I think this is something right now that is impacting everybody in this country. And I'm talking about price transparency. The Biden administration, and I have so much I want to say, but the Biden administration has delayed enforcement of key parts of a major price transparency rule by 6 months. So what was supposed to go into effect for insurers on January 1 of 2022 has now been pushed to July 1 of 2022. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it. I don't buy the reasons. I don't. I'm sorry. To tell me that these multi-billion-dollar corporations who are generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year in revenues, tens of millions of dollars a year in net profits, with some of the most sophisticated infrastructure, talking about IT. Remember, folks, we're talking about the same insurance companies who are saying they can't produce 3 machine-readable files, but they have the ability to statistically sample providers, determine outliers, determine aberrant coding patterns, determine medical necessity of a claim, all without ever looking at it. But yet they can't produce 3 machine readable files. Here's where I have a problem with this, okay? And again, this is how I feel about this. Why are we delaying something that ultimately benefits the consumer population? Why are we delaying something that ultimately benefits providers so that they can better care for their patients? Okay. There were 2 lawsuits right now that have been filed. One was actually filed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on behalf of, and they don't specify it at this point, on behalf of multiple groups and organizations that they represent. And the other one was filed by the PCMA, which is the Pharmaceutical Care Management Association that represents pharmacy benefit managers. Folks, the explanations that are actually given for the reason why they want to challenge the price transparency, and I just want to read this for just one moment, okay? Here's a couple of things that come directly from the lawsuits. First, these parts of the transparency rule will drive prescription drug costs higher, according to a PCMA release. By requiring disclosure of historical net prices, which are essentially current year net prescription drug prices, the rule will directly provide drug manufacturers access to their competitors' negotiated rebates, discounts, and price concessions. Okay? It goes on to say, quote, this in turn will allow drug manufacturers to discount less deeply as they realize their price concessions went beyond those of competitors. I'm sorry, I don't buy that at all. But let me read you this one, because this one to me is the most offensive. And you can tell me if I'm overreacting. The Chamber's lawsuit, now we're talking about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber's lawsuit challenges provisions that require pricing data to be made available in a massive, what they call a massive, machine-readable file to allow third parties to develop shopping tools for customers. Now, remember, the initial rollout requires them to have pricing for 500 shoppable services. And then within 1 year, all services have to be available for shopping. But here's what they said, okay? Wow. Quote, the organization which represents a slew of employers and industries said the requirements are not actually consumer-centric and are, in fact, counterproductive, wasteful, and unlawful. These provisions of the rule threaten to reduce competition and ultimately raise costs to consumers by revealing confidential, commercially sensitive information that competitors currently do not share with each other. I disagree. If you think for a minute the big execs aren't sitting around the table having conversations with each other about how do they maximize profitability, I mean, how do you think they all come out with the same local coverage determinations or the same medical coverage guidelines? I mean, there's conversations taking place. And you know, somebody can say, come on, Sean, you're really over. No, I don't think I am. We have a completely broken system. There is such a level of distrust between consumers and their providers and insurers, that I don't know how we get out of this cycle, and I don't know how we fix it. But it goes on to say, the required public disclosure of that closely guarded information runs afoul of long-established protections against the forced disclosure of confidential commercial information, including trade secrets, and is detrimental to the business. Why don't you just call it what it is? They don't want their secret negotiated agreements getting leaked out, because it would absolutely crush these organizations. I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a breath, because if I don't, I feel like I'm going to have to get a nitroglycerin. But I'm angry. I'm angry as a consumer that this feckle administration, CMS, would have the audacity. I mean, if hospitals were able to produce their machine readable files, okay, and get them uploaded to their websites, why can't these insurance companies? So I'm going to stop. Matt, I know you and I have had a wonderful dialogue about this, and I'm going to shut up, because I really want your perspective on this, and Eric, yours too.
Yeah, I mean, I love your passion. I think the price transparency rule is an important first step, because what it does, in my mind, is moves away from who is actually paying for it to what does it cost, right? And then the natural next step would be to, okay, the next question is, how much? I think there can be genuine debate about the efficacy of the transparency rule. Is it achieving its stated goals, which is to foster competition and to allow for the consumer to be better educated and make better healthcare decisions with regards to cost? And I don't know necessarily if that is actually the case, if that's the end result, if that is currently going on. Now, it might not be going on. It might be going on. It might not be going on. It might not be going on because so many providers and insurers have yet to publish their negotiated rates, right? But it's one of those things where you see it with the hospital stuff, and one of the things that jumps out at me with this transparency rule is it's pertinent to quote unquote shoppable services. Is that making a big enough dent in the healthcare space? Because what's necessarily a shoppable service? If somebody's going in, if somebody has an appointment for some sort of healthcare service, I think anecdotally, the three of us can recall times when a family member or loved one has gone into the hospital for something, or to the physician for something, and unexpectedly be admitted to the hospital. And so this price transparency rule isn't necessarily going to allow them to make that, to incorporate this data into their decision-making matrix. Right. And then we can kind of go off on a tangent on, if all the prices, the negotiated prices, are published, is that necessarily going to result in a decrease in price from the higher priced ones? Or are the lower priced ones going to view these higher prices and go, oh, we can get that? oh, maybe we should, raise our prices. And, it's a scenario where, the rising tide raises all the vessels, right? So
Sure.
this entity gets paid up here, this one's down here. They start to matriculate upwards in order to match the more expensive ones. And then, go on to look at bits of information like are these prices actually being considered by the consumer? Or are there other factors that are impacting the consumer decision with regards to the healthcare cost? What is the relationship like with their healthcare provider? What's the distance from the patient's home to this healthcare provider if the cheaper one's 30 miles down the road, right? So I think conceptually speaking, the transparency rule is a very good rule that gets the dialogue moving in a corrective direction from my perspective.
Right.
But I think there's other things that are out there that impact what the consumers are actually wanting to use this information for.
Sure. And don't mistake what I'm saying. I don't think the rule is perfect, right? I agree with you. I think it was a place to start. But, this is just another indication where the government says we're going to implement something and here's the date. And then they fail to implement it. And then they delay it. They
Right.
set a precedent and it gets delayed again,
Right.
delayed again, and delayed again. And, Eric, I want to give you the last word on this one, buddy. So have at it.
I think the big question for me is, what is price transparency going to do in the long term? And I think Matt started to allude to it, which is, how will the consumer use price transparency? If you have a Platinum or a Cadillac healthcare plan from your employer, where you pay a $10 copay, regardless of what you do you care about price transparency? Probably not, right? You go, you pay your $10 copay, you have no other out of pocket, and that's it. You probably don't care. I think where price transparency is going to become a factor is going to be when plans are seeking to, when an employer sponsored plan or a group plan is seeking to renegotiate its rates with the plan. That's where price transparency is going to come in. I mean, we've seen examples all the time online where two hospitals a half hour away from each other that are part of the same network have two different price points for the same service, and they're both in the same hospital network and they're in the same geographic area.
That's right.
So I think you're going to see some of the leveling off when it comes to an employer-sponsored plan renegotiating its costs with the plan itself, because that's when it's going to come into play. But I think the average consumer, look, if they're paying cash, if you're an uninsured or an underinsured, then that's where it's going to help you, because you may have a large out of pocket. If you have one of these high deductible plans,
right,
then you're obviously going to look to shop around for that best price that you can find. But, and I've said this a million times, and I know I've said it with a bunch of the conversations we've had in podcasts we do, it is, in what level of American consumerism, because healthcare is still a consumer, it's a consumable by the consumer. Right. But in what level of American consumerism do we ever get an item, service, or procedure without having some semblance as to what it's going to cost before we get it? Now,
Right.
I always say, when you go to buy a car, you can go online and look at things like, the online best practices for purchasing a car and what you're going to get. At the end of the day, no matter how good of a deal you think you got because you looked at the Kelley Blue Book or Edmunds or Carvana or PriceMax or whatever it may be, at the end of the day, you still know that no matter how good of a deal you think you got, you know that you didn't get the deal that they could have gotten, because they're still making, everybody's got to make money. So everybody comes away feeling it, and it's just a matter of whether or not you feel like you got screwed a little bit or you got screwed a lot. But even something like that, where you go in and you have some idea as to what it is you're spending on the item, service, or procedure. In no other sector of consumerism that I can think of,
right,
do we ever have a situation where you get an item, service, or procedure and truthfully have no functional clue as to what it's going to cost. And truthfully, the provider of the item, service, or procedure, in some cases, doesn't know what it's going to cost either until the final bill is tallied.
That's right.
Where else does that happen?
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I agree. It's a starting point, but I don't like before you even get to the 50-yard line, things are already getting pushed back. That's where I have a problem with it. And why are you going to ultimately delay implementation of something that benefits the consumer? I don't get it. Where's, Senator Warren out of Massachusetts, who, is all about the Consumer Protection Agency? And, where's the outrage at this point? That's what I want to know. From both sides of the aisle, where are you guys? So with that said, it brings us right to the end of this hour for the Compliance Guy podcast. I want to thank my very good friends, Eric Rubenstein and Matt Lawhon, for taking time out of their schedules and hanging out with me today. I want to say thank you to each and every single one of you that are listening to us on more than 80 podcast platforms across the United States and helping us to achieve more than 35,000 views in just 4.5 short months. Thank you so much. Again, I want to say to each and every single one of you, take care of yourselves, be good to yourself, but more importantly, be good to each other. And until next time, I'm going to try a little bit harder. This is Sean Weiss. Thanks for joining in.